Have you ever chased something so desperately, only to watch it slip through your fingers as if the universe itself whispered, "Not yet"? Maybe it was a job you thought would change your life, a relationship you believed would complete you, a moment you were sure would define your happiness, and yet it vanished, disappeared like mist in the morning sun. Most of us have felt that ache, that tightening in the chest when life doesn't go as planned, when effort seems wasted, when prayers go unanswered. And in those moments, it's easy to believe that fate is cruel, that the world is indifferent, that perhaps you simply aren't lucky enough. But what if it's not indifference? What if it's precision? What if, just beyond what your eyes can see, an invisible hand is at work, gently moving the pieces of your life into place, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect alignment of time, space, and readiness, for you to receive exactly what you deserve? In the teachings of the Buddha, there's a profound understanding of how this universe truly operates. It isn't random, it isn't chaos, and it certainly isn't personal punishment. It's law, a quiet, ancient law, one that moves not by human schedules, but by the delicate balance of cause and effect. What you plant in one season blooms in another. Some seeds sprout fast, some lie buried for years waiting. And while we tend to believe we control our destinies through sheer will, the sages knew otherwise. They spoke of conditions, that everything arises, exists, and fades away depending on the countless, interwoven conditions around it. A lotus cannot bloom in dry soil. A flame cannot rise without air. So why do we exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes in barren moments? Why do we cling to what resists, chase what flees, mourn what's not meant to stay? It's because we mistake effort for power. We believe the harder we push, the quicker life should yield. But the universe, it doesn't work that way. And those who understand this, those who learn to stay calm, to pause, to watch, they move through life like water gliding over stone. They don't fight the current. They don't demand the tide to turn. They trust the rhythm beneath it all. There's a saying in Zen, "Let the muddy water settle, you will see clearly to the bottom." When we struggle, when we demand, when we attach to outcomes, it stirs the silt of our mind, clouding our vision, blinding us to what might already be unfolding in our favor. Calm is not giving up. It's not apathy, it's wisdom. It's the strength to recognize when the soil isn't ready, when the door is better left unopened, when the delay is not a denial, but a quiet kindness from life itself. And here's the secret no one tells you. The universe doesn't work on hope. It works on harmony. When your intentions, your actions, and your inner state align with the greater flow, you won't have to force your way forward. Paths clear. Opportunities appear. The right people, the right timing, the right answers, they arrive. Not a moment too soon, not a second too late. I invite you, just for a moment, to remember a time in your life when something you wanted desperately didn't happen. Maybe it broke your heart. Maybe it felt unfair. But looking back now, wasn't there wisdom in that detour? Didn't it lead you somewhere unexpected, to someone you hadn't imagined, to a strength you didn't know you possessed? These aren't accidents. They're alignments, the invisible hand of the universe at work. And the more you resist it, the more you suffer. The more you relax into its quiet orchestration, the more ease you find. In this space we're creating together, we'll explore not only how to understand this universal rhythm, but how to live within it. To remain steady while the world spins. To stop chasing and start receiving. To trade the tight grip of control for the open hand of calm. Because when you learn to trust that the universe delivers exactly what you deserve, when you truly let go of your timelines, your should-haves and what-ifs, you begin to see the magic in every delay, the wisdom in every loss, and the unexpected gifts waiting in the quiet places. So stay with me, because once you understand how to calm the storms inside, you'll witness how life begins to reshape itself around your peace. And you might discover the universe has been waiting for you to get still all along. It's strange how most of us believe that peace is something we find out there, in the quiet of a distant beach, in a mountain sunrise, in the pause between heartbeats when the world finally stops asking things of us. But what if calm wasn't a place you visit? What if it's something you create, and not by escaping noise, but by learning to become quiet within it? The ancient masters understood this truth. They didn't chase calm through perfect conditions. They cultivated it where they stood. The Buddha himself achieved awakening not in a pristine monastery or a temple filled with incense, but beneath a simple bodhi tree, while the world around him carried on in its endless motion. Because real stillness isn't the absence of movement. It's the unshaken presence within it. Modern life, with its constant notifications, deadlines, and the quiet pressure to always be more, has trained us to believe that peace is a reward at the end of achievement. But the truth is, the busier life gets, the more vital it becomes to build an inner refuge, a place untouched by chaos, a space where your breath slows, your mind softens, and the endless stories you tell yourself begin to dissolve into quiet observation. Not every storm is meant to be fought. Some are meant to be witnessed, and the art of calm is exactly that. Not silencing the storm, but learning to stand so still within it that it can no longer touch you. But how do we do this? How do we cultivate calm in a world that seems designed to take it from us? The answer lies in a practice so ancient, yet so overlooked in modern life: presence. Not the idea of mindfulness you scroll past in Instagram quotes. Not the neatly packaged be-in-the-moment cliches. I mean real presence. The kind that feels like stepping outside of your own narrative for a moment, where you notice the coolness of the air on your skin, the subtle hum of distant traffic, the rise and fall of your breath as it carries you, without effort, from this second to the next. Calm begins the moment you stop trying to control the moment, and it deepens when you start observing it. In Buddhist philosophy, this is called sati, the practice of remembering to return to awareness. It's not about perfection. Your mind will wander, your heart will race, your worries will intrude. But every time you remember, every time you pause and notice and come home to the present, you reclaim a little more of your power. Not over the world, but over your experience within it. Because here's what most people don't realize. The world doesn't stress you. Your resistance to it does. Traffic isn't stressful. The story you tell yourself about being late is. Noise isn't stressful. The meaning you assign to it is. A rejection, a delay, a loss, none of these are inherently suffering. It's our refusal to accept what's unfolding that creates the storm inside. And this is where calm becomes a radical act. Not passivity, not giving up, but choosing to no longer be held hostage by conditions you cannot control. You begin by watching your thoughts without chasing them, like clouds moving across a sky, some dark, some light, but none of them you. You breathe and notice the breath, not as a technique, but as a homecoming. Because no matter what the outside world takes from you, it cannot take the steady rise and fall of this moment. The most powerful people in this world aren't those who control everything. They're the ones who don't need to, who can be in the middle of a storm and remain unmoved. Not because they're numb, but because they've mastered the art of stillness within themselves. This isn't something reserved for monks or sages. It's a human skill, and it starts now. Wherever you are, with whatever you're feeling, a single breath, a single moment of awareness, a single choice to stop reacting and start witnessing. And you'll notice something. When you stop feeding your panic, it weakens. When you stop believing every thought, it softens. When you stop chasing outcomes, life begins to deliver what's truly meant for you. This is the paradox the old masters knew. The calmer you become, the clearer life reveals itself, like a pond settling after the stone has sunk. And the world, in its quiet wisdom, responds to stillness far more than to struggle. So wherever you go next, whether it's the traffic, the meeting, the heartbreak, or the unknown future you keep trying to control, remember this. Calm isn't something you stumble upon. It's something you carry. And the more you cultivate it, the more you'll see the invisible hand of the universe guiding what was always meant for you. Stay with me. Because from this place of stillness, you'll begin to notice the the signs, the subtle alignments, the moments where life whispers instead of shouts, and you'll be ready to hear them. There's a quiet, invisible law that threads its way through every life, every breath, every choice we've ever made. A law so old it predates written language, so constant it governs both the rising of stars and the silent turning of your heart. We don't see it, but we feel its weight in every moment. The Buddhists call it karma, not the watered-down pop culture version, where karma is instant payback for a bad deed or some cosmic revenge plot orchestrated by the universe. No, karma is far deeper than that. It's not punishment, and it's not reward. It's simply the truth that everything you think, speak, and do plants a seed, and in time, every seed must bloom. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in this lifetime, but nothing you send into this world through your words, actions, or intentions disappears. It echoes, it expands, it returns. This is the essence of karma. What you sow, you shall reap. Look at your life. The peace you have, the people you've met, the battles you keep fighting over and over. None of it is random. Each moment you face is the flowering of seeds you planted consciously or unconsciously in countless yesterdays. And before you let that thought become heavy, understand this: karma is not a system of judgment. It's a system of cause and effect, neutral, precise, unattached. Throw a stone into a still pond and ripples will move outward. The pond isn't punishing you, it's responding. And so does life. When you speak words laced with anger, those ripples move through the lives you touch. When you act with kindness, even in small, unseen moments, those ripples travel farther than you'll ever know. You might forget the moment, but the moment doesn't forget you. And slowly, the world you move through begins to reflect the energy you've given it. That's karma. But here's the part most people miss. Karma isn't just about the future. It's alive right now, in the thoughts you choose to nourish, in the reactions you refuse to fuel, in the generosity you offer without a witness. Every breath is a seed. And the most beautiful thing is, even if you've planted forests of pain in the past, this very moment is soil for something new. The past can echo, yes, but it doesn't chain you. The Buddha taught that karma is like a wheel, spinning endlessly through lifetimes. But the moment you wake up, the moment you act with awareness, you can stop feeding the wheel. You can plant different seeds. Imagine this: a man walks through a marketplace carrying bitterness in his heart. He speaks harshly to a stranger, sends cruel words into the air like daggers. That energy lands, not just in the stranger's heart, but in his own. And later, he wonders why his life feels heavy, why every road seems hostile, why peace feels so far away. Not because the universe is punishing him, but because he's walking through a world shaped by the very energy he's released. Now picture another man, same market, same chaos, but he moves with quiet eyes. He offers kindness without reason. He smiles at the weary vendor. He lifts a fallen basket. He speaks gently where others shout. The ripples he leaves behind are different. And though storms may still come, his life bends toward a quieter shore. Not because he's lucky, because he's planting peace where conflict could grow. This isn't philosophy, it's physics, cause and effect. And so I ask you now, what are you planting? In this moment, in this conversation, in the sanctuary of your mind where no one else can hear you, because that's where karma begins. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic conversions, but in 1,000 tiny choices. A look you give, a word you swallow, a hand you extend. And as you begin to move through life with this awareness, something remarkable happens. The world softens, not because it changes, but because you do. And you begin to feel, not think, that the universe is not your enemy. It's your mirror. Every kindness you offer will find its way back. Every harm you release will one day return for reconciliation. And the deepest wisdom of karma isn't fear, it's freedom. Freedom to stop clinging to outcomes, to stop playing the victim, to stop believing that life happens to you and begin realizing it happens through you, right now, in this very breath. So carry this truth gently, not as a burden but as a lantern, Because when you remember that every step shapes the path beneath you, you start walking with intention. And before long, you'll notice that the universe, that unseen hand we spoke of, begins to respond differently. Because what you send out is always on its way home. And from this awareness, you'll find yourself starting to notice patterns, subtle connections, events and meetings and chances that feel like more than coincidence. We'll explore those next. Have you ever felt like you were holding on so tightly to a dream, a person, a plan that your whole body ached from the strain? Like life was slipping through your fingers, yet you refused to loosen your grip. We're taught to fight for what we want, to chase, to hustle, to hold on, because letting go feels like defeat. But there's a wisdom older than ambition, a quiet art known not as giving up but as surrender. And no, they are not the same. Giving up is rooted in despair. It's when you abandon the fight because you've lost hope. But surrender is born from wisdom. It's the moment you realize that your frantic need to control the outcome is what's keeping you trapped. It's not the situation. It's your attachment to how it should be. In the ancient teachings of the Buddha, there's a parable of a man clinging to a floating log in a raging river. He believes that if he lets go, he'll drown. But what he can't see is that the river, though wild, is also carrying him toward safety. If only he'd loosen his grip, he'd float. We are that man, grasping onto what we believe must happen, desperate to shape the world in our image. Certain we know best how things should unfold. But life, this vast, unseen intelligence moving through all things, often has plans far beyond our limited sight. And here's the paradox. The tighter you cling, the more you suffer. Because everything in this world is impermanent. Jobs, relationships, youth, health, even our very breath. Clinging to what cannot stay is like trying to hold back the tide with your hands. The ancient texts remind us, attachment is the root of suffering, not love, not desire, but the refusal to release when it's time. Surrender, then, is not weakness. It's not passivity. It's the strength to trust what you cannot see. It's the courage to say, I do not control this, and yet I will move with grace through whatever comes. Imagine this. A woman loses the job she believed defined her. For months, she wrestles with shame, fear, and anger. She clings to the image of who she was, terrified of what it means to be without that title. Until one morning, sitting in the quiet of her kitchen, she breathes in deeply and lets it out. And in that breath, she surrenders, not to defeat, but to life's larger unfolding. Within weeks, doors opened she could never have imagined, not because she gave up on her worth, but because she finally stepped aside and let the current carry her. This is the subtle art of letting go. It's about knowing when to act with fierce intention and when to release, to trust, to float. The Zen masters speak of the empty cup. A cup already full cannot receive new water, but an empty one is ready. Your hands clinging to old wounds, old dreams, old fears are like that cup. If you keep them clenched, nothing new can enter. But if you open them, if you loosen your grip, life can place its gifts inside. And here's what most people forget. Surrender doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop forcing. You stop believing that your worth, your peace, your joy depend on controlling outcomes. Because real peace comes not when life bends to your will, but when you find the grace to be at peace with what is. In every moment of struggle, ask yourself, am I clinging or am I flowing? One leads to exhaustion, the other to quiet strength. And the universe, that vast, invisible current we spoke of before, is always moving. Whether you fight it or follow it is your choice. But the wisest ones, those who move through storms with calm eyes and steady hearts, have all learned this truth. Let go or be dragged. And so I invite you, wherever you are, whatever weight you've been carrying, to loosen your grip. Not because you've lost, but because you're ready to rise. When you stop clinging, you don't fall. You float. And in that quiet space where control fades, you'll begin to notice something else. Patterns, whispers, synchronicities that feel too precise to be chance. The universe speaks in subtle ways to those who have learned to listen. And perhaps it's time. You started paying attention. There's a certain kind of courage this world doesn't talk about much. Not the kind that shouts, not the one that lifts heavy burdens or stands tall in battle, but the quiet, unshakable courage of trusting something you cannot see, of believing with your whole being that life knows what it's doing, even when your eyes see only chaos. In our world of instant answers and visible proofs, faith in the unseen feels like a relic, a fragile, old-fashioned notion best left to temples and dusty scriptures. And yet, it's precisely in the spaces where the path disappears, where logic fails, where control slips from your hands, that this kind of trust becomes your anchor. The Buddha once said, "Just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so too does my teaching have one taste, the taste of freedom." Freedom, not from life's challenges, but from the mind's endless demands for certainty. Because the truth is, you'll never have all the answers, you'll never see the whole map. You weren't meant to. Life was designed to unfold one step, one moment, one strange twist at a time. And between those steps lies something sacred, the unknown. But the unknown terrifies us. We try to fill it with noise, predictions, anxious plans. We cling to routines, to outcomes, to numbers in bank accounts and titles on business cards. Anything to create the illusion of safety. Yet deep down in your quietest hours, you know none of it is truly yours to hold. Faith, real, steady, living faith, isn't blind. It isn't naive. It's the clear-eyed understanding that while you may not control the winds, you can adjust your sails. That though you cannot see the shore, the current has not forgotten where it's carrying you. There's a story from the old Zen traditions. A disciple approached the master, heart heavy with doubt. "Master," he asked, "what if I let go and nothing comes to meet me?" The master smiled. "Then you will learn," he said, "that the space you feared was not empty but filled with what you could not yet see. This is the dance of trust, not leaping recklessly but moving with an open heart, knowing that the universe, like a wise old friend, has always been on your side. You've seen it, haven't you? Those moments when something you lost turned out to be a gift. When a door closed and another, far better, swung open without warning. When a person arrived in your life at the exact moment you needed them, as though summoned by some invisible force. Coincidence, we call it. But those who have walked this path long enough know better. In Buddhism, we speak of pratityasamutpada, dependent origination. The truth that all things arise together, interwoven, connected in ways our minds can barely grasp. What appears random is, in fact, part of a vast, intricate design. And while you may see only fragments, the whole tapestry has already been woven. And so, the invitation is this. When the future feels uncertain, when your heart is heavy and no clear path appears, when the world seems to move against you, pause, close your eyes, and remember, the same intelligence that sets the stars in their orbits, that turns seeds into forests and tides into waves, is moving within you. It's not out there somewhere in the sky. It pulses in your chest. It breathes with you. To trust the universe is, in truth, to trust yourself, because you are not separate from this great unfolding. You are not a leaf tossed by the wind. You are the wind. When you choose to release your need for constant proof, when you begin to move from intuition, from inner knowing rather than fear, life responds. Not always in the way you expect, but always in the way you need. And yes, it will ask you to walk through darkness at times, to sit in the unknown, to let go before something new arrives. But this is where transformation lives, in the gap between what was and what will be. And here's what's remarkable. The more you practice trusting, the clearer the signs become. A line in a book, a chance meeting, a dream that lingers. Synchronicities begin to weave themselves into your days, not because life has changed, but because you've tuned into a frequency that was always there. A language written not in words, but in moments. So tonight, when you find yourself staring at the ceiling, worrying about tomorrow, or when life delivers a detour you didn't ask for, remember, the map may be unclear, but the path is already beneath your feet. And every step, even the painful ones, is carrying you to exactly where you're meant to be. Not by accident, not by chance, but by design. The hand of the unseen moves with quiet grace. And perhaps the bravest thing you'll ever do is to let it. There's a strange irony in the way we live. We spend so much of our time chasing what we don't yet have, or clinging desperately to what we've already lost. Our minds pull us endlessly forward and back, to futures we can't control, to pasts we can't change. And yet the one place where life actually happens, where miracles are born, where healing begins, where peace quietly waits, is the one place we so often abandon. The present, right here, right now, this breath. The Buddha called it the precious human life, not because it's guaranteed, but precisely because it's fleeting. You are here for only a brief, shimmering moment between two eternities. And in that narrow sliver of existence, you hold within you the power to shape your reality, not in some distant someday, but now. The truth is, manifestation, real, conscious creation, doesn't happen in the future. It can't, because the future doesn't exist. It's a phantom, a concept, a canvas you haven't touched. And the past, it's smoke, a collection of stories you retell, often so many times you start to believe them more than you believe in what's in front of you. But this moment, this is the doorway, this is the altar, this is the one place the universe can meet you. Ancient Zen masters spoke of the gateless gate, a paradox, a path you enter not by stepping forward but by being still. Because the present isn't something you chase down, it's something you notice. It's the warmth of your hands, the sound of wind against your window, the steady drum of your heartbeat reminding you, you are alive right now. And within this breath, this small, sacred instant, lives everything you've ever longed for. Joy, peace, connection, freedom. Not waiting in some distant someday when you've finally earned it, but hovering quietly like mist around you this very moment. When you live trapped in your mind, manifestation becomes a struggle. You'll grasp at things, force outcomes, worry yourself into exhaustion. But when you anchor yourself in the here and now, something shifts. Life stops being something you chase and starts being something you allow. You begin to notice signs you would have missed. You hear the quiet wisdom beneath the noise. You feel intuitions, nudges that guide you not from fear but from truth. Because you've finally tuned in to the only place the universe ever speaks to you, this moment. There's a saying in the old Buddhist texts, 1,000 candles can be lit from a single flame, and the life of the flame will not be shortened. This moment, this exact breath is your flame, and what you choose to pour into it matters. If you fill it with worry about tomorrow or regrets about yesterday, you dim the light of what could be. But if you fill it with gratitude, with presence, with stillness, you ignite a fire that can light countless others. It's not complicated. It's not mystical. It's as simple as stopping what you're doing, taking one conscious breath, and asking yourself, what's real right now? Is it the sound of your breath, the sensation of your feet against the floor, the gentle ache behind your eyes from a long day? That's your doorway. That's where you begin. And here's the paradox. The more you live in the present, the faster your life changes. Not because you're forcing it, but because you've cleared the clutter between you and what was already yours. Manifestation isn't about pulling something to you from out there. It's about becoming the version of yourself that can finally see what's been waiting here all along. Opportunities, relationships, answers. They don't come because you desperately chase them. They appear because you've made space for them. You've stopped drowning in old regrets and future anxieties and started living where life actually exists. There's an old story about a young monk endlessly seeking enlightenment. He asked every master, read every text, meditated until his bones ached. One day, an old teacher told him, "Stop searching for the path. Wherever you stand is the path." The boy, frustrated, asked, "But when will I reach the place I seek?" The master smiled. "When you stop looking for it in the distance and realize it's beneath your feet." And so it is for you. Your peace, your abundance, your healing, they are not waiting somewhere out there, dangling in a future you must chase down. They are here, now, in the way you breathe, in the way you listen, in the way you allow yourself to be fully in this moment without reaching for another. And when you master this art, the art of presence, you discover a quiet, unshakable truth. The universe moves most gracefully through those who no longer resist it. When you're here, fully here, you become a clear channel, a vessel for wisdom, for guidance, for love. And what you manifest then isn't born from desperate wanting. It flows from alignment, from the natural, effortless unfolding of a life lived in harmony with what is. And so, the question remains, will you keep chasing what's out there? Or will you finally claim what's already here? The present is waiting, and it's been holding everything you've ever needed. And so we arrive here, not at an end but at a beginning, not at a finish line but at the doorstep of a quieter, wiser life. You've traveled through ideas ancient and eternal, through the art of calm, the quiet justice of karma, the beauty of surrender, the invisible faith in the unseen, and the sacred presence of this very moment. And now there's nothing more to seek, only something to remember. The universe has always been moving for you, even in your darkest moments. Even when you felt forgotten, overlooked, or broken, there was a current beneath your life, carrying you through things you didn't understand, toward places your mind couldn't yet see. You were never alone in the waiting. You were never abandoned in the struggle. But you see, the universe doesn't speak in shouts. It doesn't force, it doesn't rush. It whispers, it nudges. It arranges the right encounter at the precise moment. It delays the things you think you want so it can deliver what your soul actually needs. And it only asks one thing in return: your calm. Not your perfection, not your flawless discipline, not your endless hustle, just your calm. Because calm is the gateway. It's the state of being where you stop wrestling with life and start aligning with it. It's where the noise in your mind softens, and you can finally hear the quiet instructions meant only for you. It's where your frantic grasping loosens, and your open hands become ready to receive. The truth is, calm isn't passive. It's the deepest kind of power. Because in calm, you stop trying to control what was never yours to control, and you begin to master what was always within your reach. Yourself, your reactions, your focus, your breath, your energy. And as you steady those things, something extraordinary happens. Life begins to meet you differently, not because the world outside you has changed, but because you have. The ancient Buddhist masters understood this. They taught that the greatest miracle isn't to walk on water or levitate or conjure wealth out of nothing. The greatest miracle is to be fully awake in this life, to be at peace with what is, to trust the unseen currents carrying you. And when you live in that state, when you let go, when you stay calm, the universe moves through you, not against you. You become a vessel for what you were always meant to carry: love, wisdom, compassion, strength. And the things you once chased begin arriving quietly in their own time, with a grace you could never have forced. Not because you fought for them, but because you aligned with them. So if there's one thing I hope you'll carry from this journey, it's this: stop believing that everything depends on your struggle. Stop measuring your worth by how hard you push or how fast you run. The universe isn't keeping score. It's waiting for you to pause, to breathe, to remember who you are when the noise falls away. And in that stillness, to realize that everything you've been trying to manifest is already on its way. Not because you've conquered the world, but because you've finally made peace with it. This isn't the end of your story. It's a homecoming to yourself, to your calm, to the invisible hand that's always guided you, whether you noticed it or not. And from here, everything changes. Not because life gets easier, but because you get clearer. You'll begin to sense when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to be silent, when to hold on and when to let go. And you'll do it not out of fear or habit or desperation, but from a deep, steady knowing. A knowing that whatever comes, whatever leaves, whatever rises and falls in your life, you are already held, already enough, already exactly where you need to be. So take this calm with you, not as a technique, not as a trick, but as a way of being. Trust the timing of your life. Trust the whispers you can't yet explain. Trust the unseen hands rearranging your world in ways you'll only understand much later. And when in doubt, return to your breath, because that's where the universe always begins again. Right here, right now, with you.